Thank you. Everyone, I would very much like to welcome you to this webinar called The Workforce Required for Alberta's Expanding CCUS Industry. And I hope some of you were able to attend last week's workshop, which was about the hydrogen sector. So of course, we're in this series of talent needs for the evolving energy ecosystem. We're focusing on expanded employment opportunities in energy, and especially focusing on where energy trained professionals or workers can transition their skills into that broader energy ecosystem. And this series of webinars is funded by the Government of Alberta, and we'll be continuing through this year, so stay tuned. And we're very thankful for that funding. So let's just go into the objectives. What we're going to do in this webinar is first start out with the activity drivers for CCUS, carbon capture, usage, and storage jobs by looking at the current projects and what's coming up. And then we'll shift into the occupations. And we're actually going to focus on CCS occupations because most of the usage in Alberta is really in the traditional industry being used for enhanced oil recovery or EOR. So we'll focus on the occupations in the carbon capture and storage parts of the sector. And then we'll shift into how you as an energy trained professional can leverage what you know and have and are capable of doing into the CCS sector. And then finally, because this is a growing sector that's, emerging, it's still growing and emerging, we want you to be able to track the employment opportunities yourself. So we're going to go through some tips and suggestions on what to track and how to do that. So my name is Cheryl Knight. I am your facilitator for the session. We have Andrea, who is our technical support that we hope not to need in a huge way, but it's always important to have her there just in case. And taking the lion's share of the delivery is Pat Huffnagel-Smith. So as you are accustomed to by now, this webinar is typical as compared to others. Is being recorded, as we've already indicated, and you will for sure get the slides right after the webinar. We're going to ask you to remain on mute, but do let us know throughout the webinar what questions you have. So just put anything in chat that hits you as it comes up through the webinar, because we are really focused on reserving a good amount of time to take your specific questions. So we look forward to hearing what those are. So with that, let's jump into what is going on in Alberta with respect to the CCUS sector. And I'll turn it over to Pat.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl. So yes, the International Energy Agency has determined that deployment of carbon capture technology is critical to achieving global emissions reductions goals. And so here in Alberta, we are not starting from scratch in terms of developing an industry related to carbon capture, usage, and storage, or carbon capture and storage. We actually have been in this business for a number of years now. And so that really gives us sort of a leg up in terms of deploying the technologies and hopefully accelerating the pace of that deployment of carbon capture, usage, and storage. Maybe before we get into, not maybe before, but as part of this presentation, I thought just spend a couple of minutes talking about what is carbon capture, usage, and storage. And so this graphic really helps to depict sort of how the industry here in Canada is really currently operates and we anticipate will operate for, at least the early stages of energy transition and decarbonization. And so really what carbon capture is are technologies that remove CO2 from industrial emissions. And so this is a chemical process that is typically an add-on to our industrial process manufacturing sector that takes the carbon out of the emissions, what would typically be emitted into the air, and then separates it, purifies it, all that kind of good stuff, and then transports it by pipeline to geological formations that are suitable for permanent storage of carbon. Or the other options in terms of utilizing carbon is to use it to enhance the recovery of depleted oil reserves. And so that was the, sort of the process that Cheryl mentioned earlier around enhanced oil recovery. And this too is also a helpful activity in terms of practice, in terms of reducing our environmental footprint. Because obviously, if we can optimize the production of an oil well using carbon, which we want to get out of the atmosphere anyways, that means having to drill less wells to maintain a certain level of production. So overall also has a beneficial impact on our environmental footprint. And then there are certainly other ways in which companies are looking to utilize carbon. And so, a lot of these sort of processes or ways of utilizing carbon, other than putting it in the ground or using it for enhanced oil recovery, are really sort of in the early stages of commercialization. But looking at, one of the things about carbon is it can create a very, very strong fiber or material. And so looking at, are there ways in which that carbon can be utilized in the manufacturing of, again, other products that we use in everyday life. Cement being a big one. I mean, cement is one of the sort of pilots and demonstration projects that are also happening here in Alberta. I do also want to say that there is another technology related to carbon capture, and that's direct air capture technologies, which basically isn't necessarily a process that's attached to an existing industrial process, but rather is a process that is just taking carbon out of the atmosphere in general. And it's interesting that it is Canadian companies that are leading edge around this technology as well. It's in earlier stages again in terms of whether or not it's an affordable, practical carbon capture technology. But yeah, something again that we can proudly say that Canadians are leading the way on some of that work as well. So as I'd mentioned, Alberta is already a leader in carbon capture usage and storage. And, why might that be? And, certainly part of what is driving our ability to be a leader in this space is our geology and obviously our expertise, which heavily leverages our oil and gas expertise. So the interesting thing about geology, which, is you need that appropriate geological formation in order to permanently sequester carbon. And what's interesting about this in terms of a competitive advantage is that, it is a piece of the CCS puzzle that you can't simply create, right? You know, your geology is what it is. And so we are lucky to have geology that is highly suitable for sequestering carbon. You know, some of those utilization technologies that I mentioned earlier are looking at other ways that doesn't sequester the carbon, but creates, you know, sort of usable products. And so, you know, this advantage may not be as big as advantage as some of those technologies come into play. But quite frankly, you know, it's a long time before we're going to get to scaling some of those other utilizations of carbon to really sort of take away this advantage of having a very suitable geological structure in order to sequester carbon. The other sort of really key motivator for developing carbon capture, usage, and storage, especially here in Alberta, is that it really is not a one-trick pony when it comes to being a technology that supports decarbonization. It's applicable across so many of the industries that are within our economy, you know, anywhere from petrochemicals, certainly natural gas processing, power generation, refineries, you know, heavily the opportunity for applying CCS within our oil sands sector is you know, a tremendous opportunity. It's also key to the production of blue hydrogen. It's already used in the production of blue hydrogen. And, you know, if you were at our session last week, you'll know that certainly blue hydrogen is a big part of Alberta, even Canada's strategy for decarbonizing some heavy emitting industries. And so again, pulling it back to here in Alberta, because so many of our industries that are core to our economy, to our employment base, are hard to decarbonize. CCS is one of those technologies that helps us preserve the economic benefits we get from those high emitting industries, while also working towards improving our and reducing our emissions. So just to provide a little bit of a perspective in terms of, you know, the industry here in Alberta existing and sort of what's foreseen in the near future related to carbon capture, usage, and storage is maybe just to take a step back to provide some context. So globally, there are 21 carbon capture facilities. Canada has 5 of those carbon capture facilities, and Alberta has 3 of them currently in operation. Coupled with that is also the world's largest carbon gathering and transportation infrastructure in the Alberta carbon trunk line system. And so, you know, you know, when you think about that in terms of Canada having, you know, a quarter of the projects, global projects, and most of them sitting here in Alberta, that really, again, provides a perspective on, you know, where we're at in terms of developing this industry. But the other interesting thing is the number of projects that have been announced or planned. And, you know, this has just gone hand in hand with companies, you know, announcing their commitments to be net zero by 2050 and all the kinds of investment and technology that will need to be deployed in order to get there. And so currently here in Canada, in Alberta, we have 38 projects that have been announced. And so, you know, that's pretty darn significant. And then what I've also listed here are just some examples of some of the projects that have been highlighted. And there's a couple of things around that I want to point out with these examples. One, it gives you some sense of the types of companies that are involved in building out the carbon capture and storage industry. And of course, you look at these company names, and they're not unfamiliar to us because they're those very companies that know they need to deal with their emissions. But it's also interesting to note the kind of support and sort of ecosystem that the government of Alberta is building in order to support the deployment as well. And so the government of Alberta has put out 2 RFPs for projects that will help support, kind of the build out of CCS. The first round really focused on CCS projects, hubs within the industrial heartland, which of course is, Edmonton, Strathcona County area. And there's been 6 projects that have been awarded funding to, kind of go to that next step of feasibility study. And we're expecting another round of projects to be announced here at the end of October. And that really focuses on potential projects that will be supported by the Alberta government to test the feasibility of CCS. So, bottom line, I think, Cheryl, Angie, and I have been doing this work for a long, long time, and we've been talking about the opportunity and that the opportunity not only for these projects, but also for the employment opportunities associated with them. So it's just so very cool to see, sort of how far these projects have come, and, the momentum behind some of these carbon tech, clean tech technologies, especially since, kind of COVID has, not having us in lockdown. And so it is, it's kind of very exciting for the evolving energy ecosystem for sure. Like any sort of major industrial project, and any of you have been involved in this, you'll know that there's a process of going through whether or not a project will actually move from that announcement stage, where we have 38 plus projects announced, to actually moving into operations. And, we simply know that not all of those projects that are planned or have been announced are going to move through to deployment. So this is just, a way of looking at or understanding sort of the process that those projects are going to have to go through in order to ascertain whether or not they are commercially viable, and just recognizing that some of them are going to fall off the table. I think the other thing I want to say about just this chart is that, this sort of understanding piece, which is so key when you're looking at deploying emerging technologies. Really Alberta has moved past developing this understanding. And part of that has been because of our existing, the fact that we've had an industry that's existed here for, almost a decade now. But, there's a lot of sort of signals that we know that there's benefits, and the value of CCS technology has been modeled, and there's evidence, there's data to really suggest that this is a tremendous opportunity for Alberta's economy to decarbonize. And we've moved into, or I should say the provincial government has moved into setting those regulations and policies that need to be in place to see these projects move forward. Things like, ownership or leasing of subsurface pore space, which of course is critically important to the sequestering component. I'll just say, again, a lot of the projects are still in that feasibility phase. Some of them are moving into the, into the front end engineering and design phase, which of course is that much closer to deployment. And the other thing to pay attention to in terms of deploying CCUS is, like we spoke last week about hydrogen, CCS is going to be deployed in hubs as well. It's really going to, while individual plants will need that carbon capture unit associated with it, there's certainly going to be economies of scale around other kinds of infrastructure. There's going to be shared gathering lines and shared transmission lines, and certainly sharing in terms of being able to, sequester into, kind of carbon fields and that kind of stuff. So that helps to make the build out of this industry much more economical and feasible. And then I would just also point out that Advantage Energy, one of the projects mentioned previously, they're also testing the modularization of carbon capture, which again, if any of you have been part of the oil sands sector, you know that modularization has become a key and critical sort of approach to construction and expansion to really make it an economical opportunity. So moving on and talking about some of the workforce requirements for carbon capture and sequestration, as Cheryl mentioned, because the current usage is already employed within the traditional oil and gas industry. We're not going to spend a lot of time there. And some of the new technologies are too far out to really sort of spend a lot of time there. We'll focus on CCS. This slide is busy, and don't worry, I'm not going to, go through every line. But again, anybody who's been following our work knows that one of the ways in which we look to understand the occupational requirements is first to map out the activities that go behind sort of the value chain involved in any industry. And so for carbon capture and storage, there really are sort of 4 key components related to the value chain associated with this industry. That first is that carbon capture, which, as I already mentioned, is a chemical process, pipeline transmission, transporting carbon to an appropriate storage site or an oil field for EOR, underground storage or sequestration in geological structures, and then finally measurement, monitoring, and verification to ensure that the carbon is contained as planned in that geological structure. And so it was interesting. I was talking to somebody yesterday who had just come from the CCUS conference that was being held up in Edmonton, and just talking about, from their perspective, how this is just on the verge of lots and lots of activity. And so we kind of looked at all these components that are involved in carbon capture, and we go, hey, this looks pretty darn familiar to what we already do here in Alberta. Processing, pipeline transmission, underground storage, not unfamiliar to us. Certainly the measurement, monitoring, and verification, that's relatively new and emerging in terms of, technologies to make sure that what you're saying you're doing related to emissions is actually happening. And that's really technologies and skill sets that are emerging across a number of industries. What's interesting in terms of, the CCS industry is, of course, we're monitoring, measuring, and verifying things that are underground, which again, is something. Subsurface expertise is certainly expertise we have here in the province. I just want to mention that these bullet points up top are activities that need to happen across the value chain and across all of these key 4 subcommittee or subsectors. So again, those of you that follow our work will know that once we've sort of identified what some of those activities are, core activities are across the value chain, we map them to the occupations that are going to be required to carry out those activities. And so again, not going to go through all of these. They're here. You'll get this PowerPoint. But again, it doesn't take much of a quick glance to understand that the engineers, the operations and maintenance, the geoscience professionals, and those field operators, technologists and technicians are job titles that we're very familiar with here in Alberta. And very familiar with across our existing energy sector. It's what's really refreshing to see in terms of the CCS is that need for those geoscience professionals and certainly any kind of subsurface engineering or technologists, because they come from a very specialized place in the oil and gas industry. And so it's really nice to see that as we look at CCS and the amount of subsurface expertise that's required, it really will leverage the knowledge that we already have within those talent pools. So those occupations, that are across the value chain, and, what are some of those? And, I have these listed here, and they're just key and critical to accelerating the deployment of CCS. And the reason why is because they really develop that ecosystem that's required to achieve that pace of change that we want to see in order to really leverage this technology and meet those decarbonization and energy transition goals. And so a lot of these activities or a lot of these occupations focus on building the market pull for CCS technology. Others really focus on driving acceptance and adoption of not only CCS, but any kind of new or emerging technology. And then the others, such as inspectors, really help us to feel confident that the deployment of CCS will be done safely. And again, all leveraging, the expertise that we already have here in the province and across the energy sector. So digital occupations are anything that's going to be built new or even retrofitted is going to incorporate the latest, greatest digital technology. Also going to be required to support CCS. And of course, our policy and regulatory specialists to ensure that, the framework and the regulations in which we need to work within are, that's actually happening.
Pat, you cut out for a second, and I'll just monitor that. But if it happens again, I'll flag you and maybe turn off your video.
Why don't I just do that as a preventative measure?
All right.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for that. So a little bit about what might be the actual number of jobs or employment opportunities associated with CCS. And this is one way of looking at kind of the job opportunities, and this comes from, I've used a link to the source of this information, so you can access more of the details if you're so interested. But based on a scenario where 3 large-scale CCS projects are built out here in Alberta over the next 5 to 6 years, which, based on what we're seeing, isn't unrealistic. This is telling us that just right around 2,300 direct jobs could be created under that scenario, 2,200 indirect jobs, and another 1,600 induced jobs. And just to kind of define that a little bit further, direct jobs are those front-end development jobs, which would include engineering and construction, but also ongoing operations and maintenance of a carbon capture project. Indirect jobs are those that sort of ecosystem around the industry that will manufacture equipment, materials, and other kinds of supplies that the industry will need. And interestingly, this really is an opportunity for our existing manufacturing and supply sector to expand its market. A lot of the, kind of pots and pans associated with carbon capture and storage, very similar to what we see in the other industrial manufacturing sectors. And so again, it's just another sort of market or customer for that sector. And then the induced jobs are really sort of the positive impact the development of CCS projects will have on our economy as a whole, just by creating disposable income by those that are in direct and indirect jobs. And therefore, they are spending their dollars on consumer goods and services. And of course, that generates jobs in those different goods and services sectors in order to supply that demand. So, as you may already have surmised, the CCS
Okay, Pat, we're losing you. Okay, Pat,
industry.
we lost you there. So yeah, I think continue, and then if it happens again, then I'll just pick up, and then you can leave and come back in.
Sure.
You're good though.
Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what's causing issues.
The country life, Pat, the country life and the cell signal in the country.
I was going to say, we have Starlink. I think I have to get a hold of Elon and tell him that we're not that impressed at the moment. Anyways, I was just going to say, the deployment of CCS in Alberta is also going to include retrofitting our existing industry with CCS capabilities. And so, this is, adding carbon capture units to those high emitting industries to be able to cut emissions. And so this is just another way of sort of looking at job opportunities associated with retrofitting, the petrochemical sector, the oil sands sector, natural gas refining sectors with CCS capabilities. Again, it's going to create, like with any other industrial build out, a lot of jobs on the engineering and design and construction side of things. Those are those project jobs, but also a number of long-term operations jobs that will be associated with this. And I do just want to point out, this is just the scope of this particular study really is just looking at the operations jobs associated with those carbon capture units that will be retrofitted to, sort of an existing industry or, power generation, as well as, the new pipeline infrastructure that would be required to transport the carbon captured at those plants. But certainly gives some insights into the magnitude of jobs. And we know that there is work that's being done by organizations that will help, in short order here, help to sort of break down what those operations jobs might be across, the different specific occupations. So again, anybody who's familiar with our work know that, part of what we're trying to do is understand what's the best way to leverage our existing talent pool as our energy system evolves. And so we always apply our transferability assessment criteria to understand what is that opportunity to optimize the, the deep talent pool that we have here. So this is no different. We've looked at, how does those that, have garnered skills and experience in the traditional oil and gas industry, how could they transition or transfer into CCS from a technical transferability perspective? So all those core qualifications, the technical knowledge and skills that you bring to the table from oil and gas. What does that look like? What's transferability from a nature of work perspective in that how similar are the work arrangements, the workplace culture, the kind of relationships you might be working with, or even the environment that you're working in. And also, what's the similarities between the value proposition, the employee value proposition offered by CCS and those, that may be used to the energy sector from a perspective of where is the work done? What's the total compensation? What might be the career development opportunities and alignment of values? And so this is probably not surprising to anybody, given, what we talked about in terms of the kinds of activities required around the CCS value chain. But we really see a high level of transferability between the existing oil and gas talent pool and that's going to be needed by the CCS value chain. And I guess that I would also, I want to make sure that I'm not leaving the impression that that CCS is necessarily going to be a sector or an industry that's separate from our traditional energy industries. We're really going to see it integrated. And so, so just to think about that is, it's an add-on or it's an integration to our existing energy system and ecosystem. And I think the other thing that is so key to recognize here is that, sorry, let me take a step back. And because of that integration, obviously the nature of work and value proposition is going to be very similar. And I think the other thing when we're talking about CCS and a rapidly evolving sector or emerging technologies, even though we've had an industry here, the deployment really means there's going to be a lot more of these emerging occupations. If you don't have an existing talent pool of carbon capture professionals to draw from, the industry is going to draw from that next best thing. And again, we really see the next best thing coming from that oil and gas talent pool. So What if you are coming from the oil and gas industry, or and when I say oil and gas, I'm talking about, you know, the full value chain there as well, from E&P, the services sector, pipelines, oil sands, sort of, you know, the broad oil and gas industry. We see opportunity in terms of CCS. So what are the kinds of things you might want to do in order to strengthen the foundational skills you have, you know, coming from your expertise in the traditional energy sector, if you're considering a career in CCS? That might even be a career in if you're currently employed in the energy sector, that might even be a career with your existing company. It's more around that theme of how do you broaden your existing skills and build that resilient energy career. So obviously, you know, the different value chains and specific occupations are going to require specific understanding and knowledge. And so all of these things that are highlighted here are not true for all occupations across the value chain. But this will give you some insights, and I think it's probably pretty intuitive in terms of where in the value chain and what occupation is going to need some of this skills and understanding. You know, first and foremost, you know, understanding the properties and characteristics of CO2. What are they? How are they different? What does that mean in terms of how they behave? And what might be some of the potential hazards associated with that? And it will be CO2 both in a liquid and gaseous state. So, you know, that's probably a foundational understanding and knowledge that's required. But then the other, you know, sort of where in the value chain will kick in, whether or not you need to understand specific things around how to process CO2. And what's, you know, all the kind of separation, purification, liquefaction, and compression associated with that. You know, are there any particular things related to the materials or coating seals required for CO2 that might be different than the industry that you're used to working in? Obviously, you know, well design and the material choices related to injection wells for CO2. They're deep wells and they need to last for a long, long time because we're looking at permanent sequestration. So how does that impact how wells are designed and materials that are used? Obviously, the reservoir engineering needs is somewhat different, you know, because of some of the different properties of CO2. And again, the whole idea that you want to contain CO2, you're not trying to stimulate a commodity oil or gas to come to the surface. You want to keep it subsurface. You know, I won't go through all of these because I think you're probably getting a sense of just how, if you think about what the activities are associated to CCS, what might need to be sort of add-on skills you need to consider based on the kinds of foundational oil and gas skills you're bringing to the table. I would just say, you know, some of those occupations we talked about as needing to help build the ecosystem for CCS, you know, a lot of that is around understanding the technologies and the value propositions associated with that. So that's some of the techno-economic analysis, but also, you know, environmental, economic, and social benefits associated with CCS, or some of the risks and mitigation tactics that really, you know, will help create some confidence related to the deployment of these technologies. Just want to share with you, you know, some of the career resources that are out there that help to define more specifically what some of the occupations are and what some of the skill sets are. And, you know, some of these are probably familiar to some of you. They're they're all resources that Cheryl, Andrea, and I have helped to produce. And so really sort of leverage some of the information that have shared today, but also certainly sort of our years of research in this area. So you can certainly access those at your leisure after the webinar. And finally, we always like to leave you with sort of a list of other resources that can help in terms of, your market research into CCS. And so again, these are just a lot of the resources that we leverage in terms of understanding how the energy sector is evolving. And specific, some of these are very specific to carbon capture and storage. So, again, encourage you to take your learnings to that next level by accessing some of these resources. And of course, again, just insights into the kind of leading indicators that we follow to understand when those employment opportunities are going to come to fruition, kind of based on where a project might be, the kinds of spending announcements that are in place, and the kinds of, this is a big one for CCS, the kind of incentive programs that we're seeing, both from the federal and provincial governments in terms of really trying to be a catalyst in terms of progressing some of these projects. And I would also say, I think the thing about CCS is that companies are hiring for these roles right now. This isn't just a future thing. There certainly are positions that are available in companies now. And so it's not just about what's upcoming, it's what's current. And so it gives you an opportunity to evaluate your skills, what kinds of gaps you might need to fill with sort of some, upskilling or, just enhancing your knowledge in this space, and making yourself marketable to these companies that are looking for this expertise. And on that note,
well, we have some fantastic questions, Pat. I'll start off with one that has to do with CCS and the traditional industry. So the question is, how does CCS contribute or relate to our issue in Alberta with abandoned orphan wells?
Yeah, so I mean, it is an opportunity, and I believe there are companies that are out there that are assessing whether or not there's opportunity to reutilize some of those abandoned wells sites for carbon sequestration and sort of basically retrofit them for a as a injection well, or even as a monitoring well, because of course within a carbon sequestration hub also need to monitor, and some of that's done through a monitoring well. So my understanding is, of course, there's companies out there that are doing that kind of assessment and feasibility, but I also understand that it's very much on a well by well sort of basis as to whether or not that's, there is potential to reuse that well for sequestration or monitoring. And so, yeah, it's hard to say what the opportunity is, because that's just really an assessment. And I believe it's not just carte blanche as to whether or not there's potential there. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So some interest in the numbers that you presented that give an idea of employment based on, a typical order of magnitude. One of the participants wants to know in a more specific way if there's any forecasting that has been done to give an idea of the number of jobs that will be generated by the CCS industry in the next 1 to 2 years and onwards, presumably. But what can you tell us about the area of labor demand forecasting for CCS?
Well, I can say that I'm not aware of any existing labor market forecast specifically for carbon capture, CCUS. What I can say is I do know that there's at least 2 organizations that are looking more specifically at, trying to quantify the number of jobs and when they're going to be and at an occupational level. So Edmonton Global is leading a consortium of organizations looking at this. They're actually looking more at hydrogen, but of course you can't look at hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen here in Alberta without considering CCS. So I anticipate that work, which I think is going to be coming out sort of mid next year, we'll talk a bit more about carbon capture storage jobs and timing for it. And then careers in energy, the new name for PetroLMI, which of course has done oil and gas labor demand modeling for, how long, Cheryl?
Oh gosh, 22 years.
Is expanding their work beyond sort of the traditional oil and gas industry to look at, all these clean tech and carbon technologies that are, are the part of the, sort of traditional energy ecosystem. And so that too is going to quantify and look at timing for specific occupations associated with CCS. But again, they are a little bit out there. We will, in our work, we always endeavor to try and provide as much up-to-date information as we can. So if we come across anything in the meantime, we'll certainly share that through our newsletter is probably the best way. We do put our job postings dashboard sometimes gives some insights into, sort of sustainability jobs. Maybe, Andrea, we got to mark, should start paying closer attention to what's happening in the CCS space because, right. Yeah, and so that's all I can offer at this point in time other than to say it's coming.
So stay tuned. Two other really good questions that I would like to get in before we close at 1 o'clock. And one of them is a more general question that I think was stimulated by the slide on transferring skills from oil and gas into CCS and how transferable those skills are. And that with a nascent or emerging industry, there isn't an existing supply of workers with, the training in carbon capture. So that's all well and good to say, but one of the participants, is skeptical because of the involvement of AI and applicant tracking systems. How can those barriers be surmounted or enable people with transferable skills and not the exact skills to get into those jobs? What are your suggestions or recommendations around that?
Yeah, and I'll admit this is not my area of expertise. We are doing a webinar here in a few weeks around how to connect with employers and sort of what am I trying to say here? Tips and tricks to, dealing with those ATS systems. Part of what I have come to learn sitting on other panels is companies don't use it for screening as much as you might think, that especially when we're in a place where they're looking for skill sets that they know are not readily available. companies are saying they aren't they don't want to miss something that their system might screen out. And so, I was surprised at the number of companies that don't rely on ATS to screen out for certain skill sets. So, I mean, that still certainly means you have to have, in your resume or in your application, really focus in on those keywords, those key qualifications, and that kind of stuff. And again, what are some of the keywords associated with carbon capture, usage, and storage that would let them know that you are more knowledgeable than somebody else in that area? So I don't know if that was a very good answer. Cheryl, maybe you have some thoughts around that too.
And just the key point that the employers know that there isn't an existing talent pool for this sector. So they're not, even if they are large employers who utilize ATS systems, they're not generally relying on those practices because they understand that that just won't work. But I'm going to get you, Pat, to go to the next slide because I'm going to ask the final question. And it's a great segue to this slide. So the question is about connecting with employers. So the tips and tools will be really useful, and you can get those by attending our October 25th webinar. But with this question came a compliment that we're providing really good information, but we're not the employers. And is there some way that we can do something that so people can hear from the employers, Pat? And that's the obvious reason why I wanted you to go to this slide. So I'll let you speak to that.
Yes. So these are in the works, our employer forums, where we are giving, we are organizing and planning a format, in-person format or hybrid formats. I think we've got a facility that will allow us to do some pretty bang up hybrid presentations, but exactly that, where we're bringing employers to the table that can really talk more about, with probably greater expertise than us, about what they're looking for from employees, transferable skills, where they're headed in terms of what they're doing related to net zero by 2050 commitments, what that means in terms of how they're having to change or augment their operations, technologies being deployed. So all I can say is, stay tuned for those. We're pulling them together, and it could be an opportunity not only to connect with employers, via Zoom, but also in person. And so we're pretty excited about those, and the newsletter, as always, and LinkedIn are going to be the ways in which we promote those. And so, pay attention to the newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn, both our professional page, Talent Needs for the Evolving Energy Ecosystem, and our personal pages. And we hope to have some announcements around that real soon.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. We're going to call that a wrap, and you will get a copy of this as well as the recording. And we encourage you to share it with anybody and everybody that you think might be interested. And we look forward to seeing your faces and names in October. Thank you. Have a great day. Weekend.
Thank you.